Now, I'm always on the lookout for the perfect no-code tool, and after playing with Draftbit for the last few weeks, I came back with some interesting discoveries as to how it is to build apps, and especially how it is compared to FlutterFlow. And so in today's video, I'm going to be comparing FlutterFlow with Draftbit, and I'm going to be sharing some of the things that Draftbit does better, some of the things that it does about the same, and some of the things that it can be improved on as compared to FlutterFlow. Now, before we get started, remember, if you want to level up your node code game, then you definitely need to check out our amazing Patreon community. Not only do you get access to all the no code apps that I built on this channel, which means that you can view and or clone them, but you also get access to extra content that's available only for our Patreon supporters. And you can learn more about our amazing Patreon community using the link in the description below the video. Now, this comparison video is going to be divided into several parts. First, we're going to be discussing the UI. Then we're going to be discussing the logic, following by the storage. After that, we're going to talk about the pros and cons. And last but not least, I'm going to be sharing with you my personal thoughts as to which no-code tool that I recommend to the average developer. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the UI. So when you first log into Draftbit, you're going to be staring at a page that looks something like this. And if you've been using FlutterFlow for any amount of time, whether you're just a beginner or somebody who has been using it for a long time, you'll probably immediately be comfortable in this UI layout because it's very, very similar to FlutterFlow. So on the left-hand side, we have the various screens. Then we have the various components that you're going to be utilizing on a specific screen. Here we have the canvas, which represents your page here. And on the right-hand side, we have the various panes. So here you have the various UI elements that you can use to configure a specific component. You have another area where you can, configure your component using different settings, followed by navigation parameters, deep linking. And last but not least, you have your logic flows here. So here's where you set up your triggers, and then you attach various actions to a specific trigger. Additionally, if you already have some experience with FlutterFlow's layout system, namely rows, columns, things like that, you're going to be right at home with Draftbits as well. It works slightly different, but it's still very, very similar. So for instance, unlike FlutterFlow's rows and columns, Draftbit has a view component that you can simply align as a column or as a row. So if you've been using rows for aligning elements horizontally or columns for aligning elements vertically, you're going to feel immediately at home with this view component because it works very, very similar to FlutterFlow. So when I initially logged in and I started looking at it, I immediately felt at home here. I immediately knew what I need to do without, spending a lot of time watching the videos or reading documentation. Now, one of the main differences that I noticed right away when it came to building apps with Draftbit is that while you can drag and drop various elements on the left-hand panel right here, so in this components pane, I can drag and drop different elements. I can't do the same when it comes to this main page right here. So I can click on the element, and it's going to select the right element here, as well as show the properties here. But I can't really drag and drop various elements on the canvas, nor can I initiate a drag on the canvas and drop it elsewhere like I can easily do with FlutterFlow. So with FlutterFlow, not only can I drag and drop elements on the left-hand pane here, I can also drag and drop elements from the left-hand pane to the canvas. And I can also initiate dragging events on the canvas itself. And that makes it really, really easy for me to visually rearrange elements any way I want without, finding the element here and then dragging it somewhere else, for instance, as I would need to do with this system here. And so that was one of the bigger UI limitations when it came to Draftbit versus FlutterFlow. Now, there are also some little things that Draftbit lacks that FlutterFlow has, which makes your whole process of kind of setting up the elements a lot easier. So for instance, let's say I have this touchable component that's a parent of the surface. Now, let's say I want to delete this touchable component, but I do not want to delete surface. Now, in FlutterFlow, I can easily do that by deleting this widget. And so when you do that, it's only going to delete this component and not touch its children components. Here, if I do that, it's going to delete the whole thing. So if I click on delete, you see it deletes the whole children subtree, which is not something that I want. And so instead, what I need to do is I need to rearrange the items first, then delete the item, making sure that it doesn't have any children, and only then put them back together. So it's a little workaround that I have to do anytime I need to delete a middle level component without touching its children. And that is something that you can do in one click with FlutterFlow. And so apart from some of the minor things that I had to learn in order to use Draftbit effectively, I would say the UI is very intuitive and very, very easy to learn, especially if you've used a similar tool such as FlutterFlow before. The next thing I want to do is to cover the nuts and bolts of your app, and this is going to be the logic layer. And so the logic layer is what gives your app this magical feel of being able to help your users solve various problems. Now, when it comes to the logic layer, there's lots of things at play here, beginning from different variables that you can define to various actions and triggers that you can set up on various elements. And so beginning with the variables, if you click here, you're going to be on the variables pane. And so you have your app variables, device variables, and screen variables. Now, this is very similar to FlutterFlow, except with FlutterFlow, app variables are app state variables, screen variables are page state variables, and device variables are actually under app variables. You simply have a flag that you can configure that's going to make your app state variable persistent, which is essentially what device variables are. And so while I find FlutterFlow's categorization of different variables a lot more intuitive, this is also fairly simple and fairly easy to get started. Now, one thing that I was confused here is that when you click on screen variables, you can easily add a variable and you can give it a type. So for instance, I can say, well, this is var1, and I can say, okay, this is a date, or this is an object. And this is the case with FlutterFlow, because anytime you create a variable, you need to give it a type. But if I go to app variables, I'm on a completely different screen. So here I can, create a variable and say, let's say I have a variable var1, but I no longer have the place where I can give it a type. It's a completely different screen. Even though app variables and screen variables are pretty much the same variables, except they're limited by scope. Screen variables are only active on a particular screen, whereas app variables are active throughout the app. And so this part I was very, very confused about. And it's the same thing with device variables. So app variables and device variables have the same screen, whereas screen variables have that familiar variable configuration screen where I can give it an initial value, I can give it a type and all that. And so let's say I want to define a new app variable. Well, all I need to do is select app variables here, give this variable a name, and then here, I can give it an initial value. So if I give it 1, it's a number, and if I give it something else, it's a string. And so depending on the variable's initial value, it's going to take the type of that value. And so this part wasn't very intuitive for me, okay? I didn't realize that depending on, the initial value that I assign it, that variable is going to be of that type. I also realized, like, if you give it a JSON type initial value. It's going to be automatically an object. But still, I was very, very confused why they decided to have a completely different, variable screen compared to screen variables where it's very, very simple. Now, the next issue that I experienced is if you want to do custom code, if you click here, well, guess what? I need to upgrade to access custom code. And while you can certainly build an app without dealing with custom code, this is exactly what I did when I built various apps here with Draftbit. The fact of the matter is when you're using tools like this, whether it's Draftbit, Bubble, or FlutterFlow, there's going to be many situations where you will need some level of custom code to help you achieve a certain objective, whether it's just a quick one-liner for the most part, or something that's going to be a couple of lines. I use custom code all the time, and I find it very, very important. And so this was the first main issue that I experienced with Draftbit. It was the fact that I could not access custom code until I upgraded to the next plan. And if you click on choose a plan, you need to choose one of these plans here, and most likely it's going to be this pro plan for $79 a month. Whereas with FlutterFlow and many other no-code builders, you get access to some ability of having your own custom code right away with a free plan, or maybe a plan where you pay minimal amount per month. So paying $80 a month to be able to do custom code, I think it's going to be a major limitation for getting users to use this tool. Let's talk about the things that you're going to be doing a lot, and that is your triggers and actions. So if I click on any of these items, this is a touchable item, I can simply go over here and I can create the trigger. So if I click here, I have two triggers. So on press, on long press. Okay, that's fine. That's analogous to FlutterFlow. You will probably also have two triggers there as well. So if I click on press, I can create my events here. So if I click here, I have a list of events. Now, looking at this list of events that you can attach to your trigger, you can see that you have some good options when it comes to your logic. Okay, so you have API request, you have conditional stop, extract key, etc., etc. And so if you scroll down, you have some very, very solid actions. Now, the main issue that I discovered here is when it comes to logic. So you have something called a conditional stop. So if you select that, the way this works is that when data evaluates to true, no further actions will be performed. And so I found this conditional stop to be a little counterintuitive. And I bet many of you watching this video are going to feel the exact same way. And so the way this works is that you're going to have a list of conditions. So for instance, let's say I press this button. Well, I want, 10 things to execute. But let's say you have this conditional stop and it checks a certain value and it realizes it's true. Well, you can make it stop and not execute the rest of the conditions. And when I started using it, I immediately found it to be very, very counterintuitive, because in a lot of situations, I want something to happen when the condition is met, and here it's not going to happen when the condition is met. So I have to reverse my logic, whereas FlutterFlow and many other no-code builders, they give you a simple conditional. So that simple conditional has a value, and if it's true, one thing happens. If it's false, something else happens. And so the fact that you have various conditions happen if it's true, but you can also have conditions when it's false, is pretty standard when it comes to computer science. In programming, you have if true, do this, else do that. It's very, very common. Whereas here, you have a conditional stop. So if this conditional stop is true, then it's not going to execute the rest of it. And if you watch my videos when I built various apps using Draftbit, you can see how I use this functionality here. And so while you can certainly build apps with this functionality, I found it strange that they decided to include this functionality and didn't include, like, your typical standard condition statement. I initially found this very, very difficult to use, and I had to kind of think and rethink my app in order to make this work. And so I definitely don't know why they decided to do it this this way. I have not seen a single no-code tool that has this conditional stop there. Very, very weird choice. Now, one other interesting thing that I found here is that if you scroll through your list of actions here, you will see that you can run a custom function. Of course, we don't have any custom functions, and we really can't define custom functions here because we're not on that paid plan. But what I found it interesting is that you can select it here, whereas in FlutterFlow, you won't be able to select a custom function from a list of actions. You will be able to select a custom action, but a custom function is something that you will be able to select when you're dealing with various variables. And so this here is going to act like a custom action in FlutterFlow. And so once I select that, the idea is I will probably select my custom function that I defined here, and then I can pass various variables to it. And so this behavior right here works very, very similarly, if not exactly the same as FlutterFlow's custom actions. Now, if you ask me, I really like FlutterFlow's approach to this, because if I'm looking through this list, these are actions, right? It says add actions. So why am I finding a function in there? So why can I run a custom function? They should have made it so that I run a custom action, okay? And a custom function should be only accessible anytime I'm dealing with variables, because that's what a function is. A function essentially deals with variables. It doesn't do anything as far as the UI is concerned, right? It's not gonna redirect the user somewhere. It's not gonna do an action as a response to some trigger. So with FlutterFlow, there's that distinction with custom actions, custom widgets, and custom functions. And that distinction makes the whole process very, very intuitive. Whereas here, I can run a custom function as an action, which kind of blurs the line in terms of what custom function is supposed to do. Okay, is it an action that's going to actually, send some response to a user, or will it only be doing things having to do with data? So like internal things. So like you can pass it an array of numbers, it's going to do some calculation with those numbers and then spit out something else. And so that distinction that exists with FlutterFlow doesn't really exist here in Draftbit, because from what I understand, this custom function can do pretty much everything, right? It can interact with the user, it can do 1 + 1, it can do some, calculation, it can do other things. Now, if you ask me, I definitely prefer FlutterFlow's approach to this. I know what an action is, I know what a function is, I know what a widget is, I know what I need to do if I want to create a new experience for the user. I know that's going to be a custom action. It's not going to be a custom function. And so, unfortunately, we can't really test this out because I'm not on that paid plan to kind of create my own custom functions. But without having that distinction that exists in FlutterFlow, this whole process is definitely less intuitive. Another thing that wasn't really intuitive to me in the beginning was the fact of the matter is some things are not clickable by default. So for instance, if you create an icon, well, I selected this icon, but I can't go to the triggers. And that is because an icon cannot be triggered. It's not something that can generate an event. In order to attach an action to an icon, what you first need to do is you need to come in here and you need to search for pressable. What I can do is I can make the icon the child of a pressable by dragging it here. And now if I click on pressable, I can attach an event to this specific component. And obviously, because an icon is a child of pressable, any event that I attach to pressable is going to be automatically applicable to icon, right? So if I, have an event when somebody presses this component, they're going to be pressing the icon, right? Because pressable is invisible. And so this is the case when it comes to lots of components here inside of Draftbit. So for instance, with text, right? If you select text, well, you can't attach anything to text, okay? Unless you do the same thing, unless it becomes a child of something that can be an action to something, such as pressable. And so in this case, you will also need to make text a child of pressable. Now, I understand why they decided to do it, But again, you don't need to do that with FlutterFlow. With FlutterFlow, you have an icon, but you also have an icon button, right? So if you want just an icon that's not clickable, then you use an icon. If you want an icon that's clickable, you use an icon button. Now, while I understand why they decided to do it, because there's going to be situations where you want an icon that's not pressable or you want an icon that's pressable, I feel that is an extra step that users should need to take, right? The purpose of a no-code tool is to simplify development. So why do we need to have a new element here that needs to be a parent of something? Just create another element or give it some kind of a flag, right? Another thing that you can do is you can have an icon and you can make it clickable. So you can enable this, have a big, flag over there, like a checkbox. So if I click this checkbox, all my options become enabled. And, this specific component becomes a pressable button. It becomes a button that can generate events. So me needing to, make a pressable parent of a specific widget that I wanted, to be pressable, right? I feel it's not as intuitive as it could have been. This was not something that I needed to do with FlutterFlow, and I definitely prefer FlutterFlow's approach over this one here. Next, let's talk about your database backend. And this is a big one here because one of the first things that I learned when it comes to Draftbit is that a Draftbit does not have an internal database backend that you can use, and that's fine. But there's another problem, is that with Draftbit, everything is a REST API. When you click on this button here, you will immediately see what I mean. So while you can add your own custom API, which is great, all no-code tools allow you to add your custom API. Down below, they have a section called Connect a Service REST. And when I saw this, I immediately rejoiced because I thought this means that this is going to be a native way of connecting a particular service to my app. But when I clicked on a particular service, I was immediately disappointed because all I needed to do was configure another REST service. So in other words, all of this is the same, okay? This REST API and all of these, they're all REST APIs that you need to configure. And what this means is that Draftbit does not have a native connection to any database backend. And so, for instance, FlutterFlow does not have its own internal database backend like Bubble, but at least with FlutterFlow, I can natively connect it to Firebase. I can natively connect it to Supabase, okay? Here, I can't really do that. So if I click on Supabase, guess what? I need to configure the REST API from Supabase in order for Draftbit to connect to it. And this is very, very frustrating because with FlutterFlow, it's very, very easy to connect your app to Firestore or Supabase. Okay, I don't need to know any of these APIs. I don't need to do anything. FlutterFlow has done the heavy lifting. All I need to do is, set up my, publicly available API key, and then I'm going to have access to creating new records, changing existing records, or deleting records as well. Whereas here, okay, I'm going to configure my name, base URL, and then I need to create various operations. Okay, I need to create my create operation, delete operation, change operation, and all of that. And I find this very, very frustrating because this means that, Draftbit does not come with any native adapters to any backend services out of the box. And so while Draftbit is trying to guide you by creating either a custom API or connect to a service using various backends here, I still need to do all the work. I still need to go out and fetch the API key. I need to create the operations. I need to do all that. And really, what's the point of using a no-code tool if there's no native way of connecting to our backend database? I felt it was kind of sloppy from Draftbit to not include either an internal database like Adalo or Bubble, but also not give you a native way in order to connect to some third-party database like FlutterFlow. So I was very, very disappointed with that. In fact, I don't remember seeing a no-code tool that does not have either an internal database or a native way of connecting to a third-party service. I don't believe there's another tool that I tested. I think this was the first tool without that important capability. And so what I ended up doing was I obviously needed to find a backend database that supported REST API. And then I needed to create various API endpoints. So as you can see, I have, a cart entity. I have add to cart, delete to cart, list cart. I have get product, list products. I even have a specific entity for a login as well. And obviously, I wouldn't need to do any of this if I was building an app with FlutterFlow. So a lot of extra work. And this is something that the Draftbit team could have done it for their users. They actually could have implemented this native connections, these adapters to maybe a couple of external databases such as Firestore or Firestore and Supabase, or maybe just Supabase, but at least something to make the whole process a lot easier. So this was definitely a letdown right here. The next issue that I faced was when it came to actually displaying this data inside of the app. So for instance, let's say I have this view right here. And what I can do is I can create a list, right? So I can say, well, I want a list right here. So it's going to put a list view. But if I click on this list view and I go to this database icon here, well, I don't have access to our database, right? I can scroll through this whole list. I don't have access to the database. And that is because you need to do something else in order to have access to your data inside of your list component. And specifically what you need to do is you need to make another component the parent of your list component, and that component is called fetch. So if you search for fetch, you're going to find fetch here. So if I add fetch here, what I need to do is I need to make fetch the parent of that list component. So if I remove it here and I put it here, and then I can take list and make list the child of fetch. Next thing I need to do is click on fetch and actually configure the type of data that I'm going to be dealing with. So I'm going to click here, select my REST API. And in this case, I'm going to be listing. So I'm going to say list products here. And right here, I'm going to be showing a preview. Now, I don't have access to the database anymore. Otherwise, it would have shown a list of products here. And this arguably is a very, very nice feature, being able to view the data in line, right? In FlutterFlow, if I'm doing any kind of API calls, it's a separate screen. It's a separate setup. I need to go somewhere else. I need to test it. I need to make sure everything is fine. While in Draftbit, you can see it in line, which makes the whole process a lot easier. Now, once I configure what kind of data I want to get, the next thing I need to do is go to list and select data. And now, as you can see, I actually have access to this data because this fetch is the parent. If I do not make fetch the parent of list, then list is not going to have access to that data. And I find that very, very counterintuitive, because in FlutterFlow, anytime you create a list, guess what? It has a place where you can specify the kind of data that you may want to populate that list with. Every list widget in FlutterFlow has the ability to access this data. But if I don't have this fetch as the parent, I won't be able to have it feed the data. And so this is another situation, just like with the pressable, that, is making me scratch my head, because this thing here could have been built in. Like, why do I need to go out and actually put some widget as the parent? And this widget is not going to get displayed. It's invisible, but it needs to be the parent of list, because otherwise list is not going to have access to any data. So just like with pressable, I feel that this is something that the Draftbit team could have taken care for you and not required you to actually go out and have a parent widget. I find that very, very counterintuitive. And I definitely did not like that aspect. I really, really like FlutterFlow's approach with pressable, but also with this fetch capability. But nevertheless, once you set up your backend REST API here, And you also don't forget to make fetch the parent of any component that's actually going to be fetching your data. You'll be able to get your data and easily display it without any issues whatsoever. And so now that we've covered the three main layers that you need to understand when you're building an app, namely the UI, the logic, and the storage, let me give you some final thoughts as to what was going through my head as I was using this tool and as I was building various apps with it. Now, the thing that I liked the most about Draftbit was the fact that you can quickly and easily go from designing your app and testing a couple of things to actually previewing the production ready version of your app. So let's say I'm looking at this app here. I'm thinking about some of the things that I want to do. All I need to do is click on navigate, and that's going to go ahead and show me the preview, the production ready version of the app. And this is done almost instantly. And so this right away is one of the bigger benefits of using Draftbit. When you're using FlutterFlow, that first time you try to compile your app, it's going to take some time. It's going to take a couple of minutes, depending on the load, depending on a bunch of other factors. But with Draftbit, it's almost always instant. And so this is one of the things that I immediately noticed and I was immediately impressed with. So this makes your development a lot more pleasant and rewarding. Now, when I was using this tool to build my apps, I had two thoughts going through my head. The first thought that was going through my head was that Draftbit lacks a lot of these big features that we take for granted when we are using FlutterFlow. So things like your backend database, right? Draftbit does not have any native connections to any backend database. It also doesn't have an internal database. And so I found it rather annoying because that meant I needed to be a third-party database expert and I needed to be able to find the right backend database that I can use with my app because I needed to make sure that they can support REST and all that. So there's a lot of work that I needed to do, and that is the type of work I wouldn't need to do otherwise, especially with FlutterFlow, because I can get started very, very easily. So there was a bunch of these big things, right? The fact that I cannot use custom functions here, right? Custom code, I need to pay $80 a month, okay? Whereas with FlutterFlow, I can use them in a free plan. And so it was this collection of these big limitations. The second thought that I had going through my mind as I was using Draftbit was that FlutterFlow just feels more polished, okay? I kept thinking to myself, you know, FlutterFlow is just more polished, okay? When it comes to deleting, you know, a middle view, so to speak, right? In a hierarchy, let's say I want to delete this active, you know, view here without touching its descendants. Well, in FlutterFlow, it's just one click. In Draftbit, I go out, I need to rearrange elements, right? If I am configuring variables here, right? If I click here, well, screen variables, okay, it's familiar to me. Okay, I want to specify the type, number, date. But if I go to app variables, there's no type configuration. Why is that? Whereas with FlutterFlow, regardless if you go to your page state variable or your app state variables, or the fact is, you know, if you go to your app state variable, you can make it a device variable by, you know, checking one checkbox. It's all very, very easy with FlutterFlow, whereas here it's just not as polished. And I still was able to take advantage of these app variables and the screen variables. But, you know, with FlutterFlow, it's just easier. Things just make more sense. Whereas here, I have to fight with this. Then I have to fight with something else. Then I have to fight, you know, with something else, something, whether it's the fact is you can't drag and drop things, you know, onto or from the canvas, which is kind of annoying as well. Or the fact is you can't delete, you know, certain elements, or you can't wrap an element, right? So not only can't I delete an element, but I also can't wrap an element, okay? So that was an annoying thing as well. So there's all of these things that were just not as easy as compared to how you would be able to do it with FlutterFlow. So while I think Draftbit is an amazing tool, it shows a lot of promise. I'm sure if they keep adding features, it's going to get there somewhere. It's going to be competitive to a tool such as FlutterFlow. Right now, FlutterFlow is just a lot easier to use. It's a joy to use, and I'm just a lot more comfortable with FlutterFlow as compared to Draftbit. And so my final verdict is that FlutterFlow is just easier to use. It's a lot more polished. Draftbit is showing a lot of potential, but it's just not there yet. It's not at the level of FlutterFlow. But who knows? Let's see what the future brings. Things are changing rapidly, and so it will be interesting to see how things will change in a year or in 6 months from now. In any case, I will be on the lookout for various no-code tools, but right now I definitely feel the most comfortable with FlutterFlow. And if you're looking to build amazing no-code apps and you want to get started right away, you want to get started quickly, and you want to be able to build your apps very, very quickly as well, then definitely check out Mastering FlutterFlow, which is my comprehensive FlutterFlow training that walks you step by step on everything that you need to know when it comes to building simple to very, very complex apps quickly and easily. When you join Mastering FlutterFlow, you will have lifetime access to the training that gets updated regularly, so it never gets stale, and it always includes the latest FlutterFlow features and functionalities. And so you're always going to be up to date with the latest FlutterFlow technologies. And best of all, when you join Mastering FlutterFlow, you're going to have access to our private Discord community where we're going to help you build the app of your dreams or merely answer any of the questions that you have when it comes to the training or building no-code apps. And so you'll be joining the best community in the world when it comes to building no-code apps fast. And if all of this sounds like something that you may be interested in, then you can learn more about the training and become a member using the link in the description below the video.